Nature has many tricks wherewith she convinces man of his finity. But the most tremendous, the most stupefying of all, is the passive phase of the white silence. All movement ceases. The sky clears. The heavens are as brass. The slightest whisper seems sacrilege, and man becomes timid, affrighted at the sound of his own voice. There, nobody talks, everybody thinks. You get your true perspective. I got mine.
Jack London, author of White Fang, The Call of the Wild, and The Sea Wolf, was the most famous writer of his time. At the beginning of the 20th century, he came to symbolize adventure itself. He was alternately a vagrant, gold prospector, sailor, and also a rancher, war reporter, and a passionately militant socialist. He lived life at a hectic pace, and his journey, intertwined with his writing, strikes us with its intensity.
There's just so many things that he did that to grasp the essence of Jack London is trying to grab like the smoke from a fire. You put your hands on it, but it kind of escapes. It's hard to grab on to exactly what he was and who he was and all that he did. He was a participant. He wasn't just an observer. He was in the thick of it.
If you think about images of American writers, the writer as action hero, Mark Twain kind of fulfilled that role, but really London is the first to kind of set that precedent as he was a writer out in the world, traveling, adventuring, having these exotic experiences, often in faraway lands. And of course, it kind of helped to create this paradigm which Hemingway and other writers would follow.
When Jack was born on the 12th of January, 1876, the United States was just 100 years old, and the conquest of the American frontier was almost at an end. In that same year, General Custer's 7th Regiment was massacred at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and Wild Bill Hickok was gunned down in a Dakota saloon.
It's very interesting that Jack London was born in that year, 1876, because if you pick up a university textbook of American history, you're going to have Volume 1 up to 1876 and Volume 2, 1876 to the present. And so Jack is born at precisely this moment where modern America is born, and his life is a trajectory through the modernization of America.
At the end of the 19th century, millions of new immigrants from Europe were flooding into an America which was undergoing profound change, set on the path of industrialization and technical progress. The big cities of the East were experiencing unprecedented change. Imposing skyscrapers and electric tramways were coming to define the new urban landscape, while industrial output was increasing dramatically. The banks and captains of industry had taken power. James Hill and his network of transcontinental railroads, the financier John Morgan, John Davison Rockefeller, the first billionaire of this new age. But this remarkable expansion also threw millions of Americans into poverty, sacrificing them in the race for profit and economic success.
One of the things that was happening during London's lifetime was a division in America between a new elite of very wealthy individuals, heads of the corporations, and also the emergence of what we might call the new masses, of people who were stuck in grinding poverty, living in these new industrial cities, working under incredibly difficult conditions, very dangerous conditions, and living lives of desperate poverty. That's a huge change in the demography of America and the economy of America.
Jack grew up on the West Coast, in the poor districts of San Francisco. Since the gold rush of 1849, the city had attracted many investors and adventurers. Flora, his mother, was passionate about astrology and spiritualism, famous for her seances and fortune-telling. She moved there in 1874 with her partner William Cheney, an astrologist whose conferences were met with modest success. When she became pregnant, he decided to leave. Jack was never to know him.
Flora Wellman was Jack London's mother, his birth mother. Sadly, she tried to induce an abortion in several different ways while she was expecting Jack. None of them worked, including she tried to shoot herself, but the bullet glanced off of her forehead. I mean, this is pretty appalling. So Jack was born into a troubled family situation.
Jack did feel rejected, I think, by his mother. From what Jack has said about her, he felt that she was rather cold to him, and that I think he said in one place that she called him my badge of shame.
6 months after Jack was born, Flora married John London, who adopted the young boy and gave him his name. It was through his adopted father and his stepsister Eliza that Jack would find tenderness and understanding. Through his nanny, Jeannie Prentice, too, a former Afro-American slave, who would remain close to him throughout his life. The London family's circumstances were humble. The tales of voyages that Jack read voraciously were often his only means of escape.
I had never had toys, no playthings like other children. My first memories of life were pinched by poverty. The pinch of poverty had been chronic.
To overcome their financial difficulties, John London constantly turned his hand to new jobs. The family regularly moved from town to town in the Bay Area, to Alameda, San Mateo, or Oakland. Flora quickly demanded that Jack contribute to the family housekeeping. While he was still only 14 years old, Jack had to leave school and go to work in a cannery in Oakland, where he was paid 10 cents an hour.
His surroundings were poor, and he had firsthand experience with the lives of the poor and the lives of the proletariat class and with the working class. And that was the milieu that he came. He was born into that class, and he really never lost a sense of being a part of that class.
No question about his difficult childhood. He didn't go as hungry as he likes us to think, but he did work hard. Later, he fictionalized that in that terrific story called The Apostate. And I say that is not literally biographical, but emotionally it is biographical in terms of the kind of working circumstances that those kids suffered back in the late 19th century.
There was no joyousness in life for him. The procession of the days he never saw. The nights he slept away in twitching unconsciousness. The rest of the time he worked, and his consciousness was machine consciousness. Outside this, his mind was a blank. He was a work beast. He had no mental life whatever.
At that time, more than 1.5 million of American children were in the same situation. It would not be before 1938 that radical reforms were made to legislation. At the Oakland docks, just around the corner from the cannery, Jack was able to escape this suffocating atmosphere. He looked on enviously at the oyster pirates who operated in the bay and dreamed of their exploits.
The penalty was state imprisonment, the stripes, and the lockstep. And what of that? There was vastly more romance in being an oyster pirate or a convict than in being a machine slave.
Jack borrowed $300 from his former nanny and bought his own sloop, the Razzle Dazzle.
He began a life of crime. This was a lot more lucrative than setting the bowling pins in the bowling alley or working in the hemp factory or in a canning factory. This was a new world for him, and he thrived in it. He really blossomed, and I think that was the beginning of his life of adventure.
Going out on the bay when he was an adolescent, he would hang out at the bars, of course, with the older men, and he developed an idea about what it was like to be a male, be a man at that time that was different from the factory life, that offered more opportunities.
When I was 16, I had already earned the title of Prince. But this title was given me by a gang of cutthroats and thieves by whom I was called the Prince of the Oyster Pirates.
He had to dodge the constant shots from night watchmen and the fish patrol. Every evening, money was spent lavishly in the taverns, where Jack, a glass in his hand, learned how to earn the respect of the bay's hard nuts. Johnny Heinold's first and last chance saloon on the waterfront became his second home. Then, at the beginning of 1892, he decided to jump ships. He joined the fish patrol and was paid through the fines imposed on the pirates he helped arrest.
It seemed to be that Jack was born to be a sailor. He had it in his blood somehow. And somehow he was able to master a very difficult body of water, the San Francisco Bay. And once he had mastered that, he was ready to go to the Pacific Ocean at a very early age.
On the 20th of January, 1893, he enlisted as a sailor aboard a three-mast schooner, the Sophia Sutherland, for the seal hunting season. The Pacific crossing lasted 51 days before the Sophia reached the icy waters of the Bering Sea. This first experience of the open sea would remain unforgettable for an adolescent thirsty for adventure. When the schooner got caught in a typhoon, he even found himself alone at the helm for nearly 40 minutes. On returning to Oakland, his mother encouraged him to write an account of the trip as a submission for a competition in a local newspaper, the San Francisco Call. Jack won first prize. On the 12th of November, 1893, Typhoon off the coast of Japan was the first piece published by Jack London before he even began thinking about becoming a writer. While he was away, however, his foster father's health deteriorated. To help his family out financially, Jack had no other choice than to return to factory work. First in a jute mill, then at the Oakland power plant, where he worked shoveling coal to feed the boilers.
He goes home every night just exhausted and broken. And finally, one of the co-workers comes up to him and says, "Hey, I've got to tell you something. You're doing the work of two men. The superintendent fired two grown men who were doing this job previous to you and hired you to do the job for $30 a month for what two men were getting paid $40 each a month to perform." And so that was London's experience with how capitalism worked. You know, you kind of squeeze the worker to increase the profits.
Jack resigned and had difficulty finding a new job. The 1893 financial crisis worsened the economic situation and plunged the country into the worst recession of its young history. America now counted 2 million unemployed and seasonal workers.
It was during the Depression of the 1890s that a man in the Midwest by the name of Jacob Coxey, who was a populist and thought that one way we can express our discontent and our demand for relief is to go with our boots on and march across America to Washington, D.C., where we will confront our elected officials and say, we are desperate, we need some kind of relief.
Across the country, an army of unemployed men began marching. Jack decided to join the West Coast contingent, made up of around 600 men and commanded by a certain Charles Kelly. Having missed their departure, he joined up with the army at the Rocky Mountains and continued on with them as they made their way east. They traveled on foot or crammed into cattle wagons. The army increased in number as it marched on. Soon there were 2,000 of them, and they received many tokens of solidarity on the way. But in May, the announcement that Coxey had been arrested dealt a death blow to the army's morale. The army of unemployed was washed out, and Jack decided to abandon them at Hannibal, Missouri. But he had acquired a taste for this new life on the road of America. Without a penny to his name, he decided to carry on traveling as a hobo, as a stowaway on goods trains, wherever the mood took him.
The road had gripped me and would not let me go. Tomorrow would be another day, and I was young.
He ended up being arrested for vagrancy in Erie, Pennsylvania, and went to a penitentiary for a month. And that experience of the injustice in the courtroom, as well as just the fact that he was arrested for being basically homeless, had a great impact on him.
I want to think that he wasn't victimized because, as he said, he was smart enough to pal up to one of the veterans there that kind of took care of him. But he said, that determined me to get out of the submerged tent. Never again am I going to put myself in a situation like those poor devils are in.
Once he had served his prison sentence, Jack decided to discover the major cities of the East before crossing Canada to reach California, a journey of more than 1,200 miles, which he undertook in the company of large numbers of other miserable travelers.
I found there all sorts of men, sailormen, soldiermen, labormen, all wrenched and distorted and twisted out of shape by toil and hardship and accident, and cast adrift by their masters like so many old horses. I saw the picture of the social pit as vividly as though it were a concrete thing, and I confess, a terror seized me.
What he saw on the road with the tramps and the hobos, he saw individuals who formerly were just like him when they were younger. But when they got older, they began to break down and they began to collapse. And that's when they dropped down into that submerged tent. And so one of the things that it prompted him to do was decide he wasn't going to work with his body anymore. He was going to use his mind. And there began his kind of frantic search for knowledge.
Jack then decided to go back to school. He enrolled at the Oakland High School, determined to acquire the tools to become a writer. To pay for his lessons, he got a job as the school's janitor and swept the classrooms clean every day.
Early and late, I was at it, writing, typing, studying grammar, studying writing and all the forms of writing, and studying the writers who succeeded in order to find out how they succeeded. At times, I forgot to eat and refused to tear myself away from my passionate outpouring.
Jack worked tirelessly. He allowed himself only minimal sleep. He also went religiously to the Oakland Public Library, where he regularly borrowed new works.
He read constantly, and he learned that way. So it was not a real directed and planned reading program, but it was very much his own devising. And he simply soaked up everything he read.
Reading works by Karl Marx, Charles Darwin, and Herbert Spencer was a revelation for Jack. He recognized himself in their ideas, and this inspired in him a new political conscience.
Other and greater minds, before I was born, had worked out all that I had thought, and a vast deal more. I discovered that I was a socialist.
Well, socialism has deep roots in American history. The Socialist Labor Party founded in the year of London's birth, 1876, was one of the strongest of those socialist political parties looking to elect socialist officials to office and bring about fundamental change. 20 years after the founding of the party, Jack London signed up as a member.
He was totally dedicated to whatever could enable the poor people, the working men and working folks, to raise themselves out of the pit there. And whatever reforms were required, he was going to crusade for them, and he did for many, many years.
Arise, ye Americans, patriots and optimists. Awake, seize the reins of a corrupted government, and educate your masses.
People now called him the Boy Socialist. His passionate speeches in Oakland Town Square even earned him a place in prison for disturbing the peace. After high school, he passed the Berkeley University entrance exam with flying colors and took up a place there in September 1896. He dropped out after only one term, however, unable to finance his education and finding the studies boring.
He felt he could learn faster and better on his own than among the students who seemed so immature to him and so naive. And here he was a man of the world already. He'd been around the world on this sealing vessel. And this is kind of quintessential Jack London, to know that he could do it for himself better and faster than anyone else could.
The announcement in San Francisco on the 14th of July, 1897, that seams of gold had been discovered in the Klondike, a wild region in Western Canada, triggered a stampede. Over the following weeks, thousands of men set off for Alaska before undertaking the perilous trek across the far north. Jack was one of the first to leave on the 25th of July.
Like many people who were desperate for money, he decided to go. People tend to romanticize the gold rush. It was a wonderful adventure, and it was for him, but it was also a brutal, deadly thing to try to do. Many people died trying to get up to those gold fields. But for Jack, I think it was the life-changing experience.
With several seasoned men he had met along the way, Jack began to climb the terrible Chilkoot Pass. At an altitude of 1,000 meters, the Chilkoot offered the most direct passage through the mountains bordering Canada. To reach it, Gold Rush hopefuls had to climb a steep ice-covered slope, step by step, carrying all their equipment on their backs.
Jack made, I don't know how many trips up and down that trail, probably 10. And on the trail, if you fell down or you fell to the side, they wouldn't let you back in the line. So you had to go all the way back to the bottom and start over. I can't believe that people were able to accomplish this.
Once the pass had been crossed, prospectors had to take a track and head for the lake region, build their own boats, and sail north down the Yukon River. It was a race against time to finish the voyage before winter set in and turned the waters into ice. A month of sailing, covering 400 miles, facing frequent storms and strong currents. On the 9th of October, Jack and his companions set up camp at Henderson Creek and chose the sites where they would prospect. Then they went to Dawson City, the only town in the region, built at the very start of the gold rush to register the claims. Jack's claim bore the number 54. Winter then descended, preventing any attempt at prospecting. The gold prospectors, shut up in their isolated cabins, now had to wait patiently during the long winter months, enduring the bitter cold. Jack would say later that a night in the Klondike was like 40 days in a refrigerator. He had taken several books with him, not only a survival guide, of course, indispensable in these wild regions, but also Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species and Paradise Lost, John Milton's epic poem, which describes a Christian vision of creation. When he wanted to stave off boredom, Jack visited other prospectors settled nearby to have a drink or share a meal. The menu was always the same: beans cooked in lard and slices of sourdough bread. Sometimes the fruits of a hunting trip would break the monotony. Conversations were lively around the fire, and Jack, although only 20 at the time, often spoke up to defend his socialist convictions. On the surrounding tracks, he also liked to contemplate the wilderness, later referring to the eternal quiet, the white silence.
The white silence is his metaphor for an uncaring nature, that nature is blank and silent. But the white silence, especially in something like The Call of the Wild or the other stories up there, is not altogether bad. What it means is that we're all on the same playing field, and that nature does not respond to romantic feelings. And the white silence can be only overcome by connections with other people. The most important thing I think he learned up there was comradeship. Because in Jack London's stories, if you go alone on the trail without a trail mate, you die. And many people make the mistake of thinking of London's heroes as these lone wolves out there in the Klondike, but that's incorrect. His main characters are people who work to help other people survive.
With the arrival of spring, the melting snow allowed prospecting to begin again. Jack soon realized that the Klondike was not to be the El Dorado he had hoped for. In the end, the gold dust he had collected netted him just $4.50. His lack of experience was no doubt to blame, but his deteriorating health also played a part. He contracted scurvy, the Arctic leprosy, brought about by a lack of fresh vegetables in his diet. His condition continued to worsen, and if he wanted to stay alive, he had no other choice but to return to California as quickly as possible. From his experience in the far north, he brought back another kind of nugget: the countless stories he had garnered from the other prospectors on the tracks or in the saloon bars in Dawson. Trappers fighting off the cold, the loneliness, the wolves, the Indians, and the madness of the gold rush itself.
I think that was a crucial experience in terms of providing him with material to write about. What he's doing, he's listening, and he's absorbing, and he's observing, and all of that he's taking in and will be transformed into fiction, and I think ultimately great literature, including a number of those Klondike stories. So both personally and in turn professionally, I think he was on target when he said the Klondike made me. I think that applies to him as a writer and perhaps as a human being, as a man as well.
On his return, Jack learned that John London, his foster father, had just died. He was without financial means and now had to take care of his family's needs alone. He decided to give himself over to writing with an unbelievable doggedness.
He wrote and he wrote and he wrote. He wrote poems, he wrote essays, he wrote short stories. They all came back. He pawned his coat, his bicycle, even his typewriter at one point just to buy stamps so he could send in his manuscripts. Finally, he got lucky. A magazine called The Black Cat picked up his first story and published it. But the big success came in 1900 when the Atlantic Monthly accepted an Odyssey of the North, and he became instantly famous.
He brought a new voice and a new way of looking at life that simply slammed the American public. So he came on the scene with an explosion, and he became known very, very quickly. His first volume of short stories, published in 1900, is called The Son of the Wolf, and that book sold very, very well.
His stories were direct, accessible, they were robust. They were written in kind of this new style, which everyone could understand, at least on some level. And so in that way, he could write for that magazine market. He could attract a popular audience. He could get readers from the middle class to read his stories. And he also attracted the intelligentsia of the day.
Jack now organized his life rigorously. Every day he sat down at his work table and forced himself to write at least 1,000 words. He would never waver from this golden rule. With America entering the 20th century, a new life was beginning for Jack. The very day his first book was published, he married Bessie Mattern, a friend who had helped him prepare for the university entrance exam. The couple moved into a large 7-roomed house, and the family soon grew with the birth of a little daughter, Joan. He now belonged to San Francisco's artistic elite, and critics heaped praise upon him. His literary success made him a media celebrity, catching the general public's imagination, and the newspapers lapped him up. Not only his name, but also his face were known to everybody.
He was front-page stuff. He was remarkably handsome. He was a famous writer, very famous, very popular. He was a notorious political figure. He was a celebrated adventurer. I'm hard-pressed to think of any contemporary celebrity to compare with Jack London.
Now aged 25, Jack, the poor kid from the suburbs of Oakland, had become, in the eyes of critics, the Kipling of the North. It was for a very different kind of genre, however, that he decided to travel to London in the summer of 1902. With The People of the Abyss, this time he intended to portray the miserable living conditions in the East End, where all the immigrants and underprivileged people of London were gathered together. To his indignant prose, he added many photographs. The invention of photographic film by George Eastman, the founder of Kodak, led to the appearance of a new generation of discreet, easy-to-handle cameras. Jack acquired several of them, including the Kodak 3A, which, once its lens had been retracted, could be carried in a pocket. It would be his faithful companion throughout his travels.
London said that The People of the Abyss was his favorite book, that he put more of himself into that book than to any other book that he wrote. It's kind of an early instance of embedded journalism. London was in London, England in 1902, and he disguised himself as a stranded American sailor and basically went underground to the slums in the East End of London to investigate the living conditions. He's looking at how this urban environment of deprivation and harshness is just shaping these people and crushing them.
A short and stunted people is created, a pavement folk, as it were, lacking stamina and strength. The men become caricatures of what physical men ought to be, and their women and children are pale and anemic, with eyes ringed darkly, who stoop and slouch and are early twisted out of all shapeliness and beauty. The men of the ghetto are the men who are left, a deteriorated stock left to undergo still further deterioration.
He wasn't looking at them as types. He was looking at them as individuals, and he saw them that way, and they knew that, and so they trusted him. You can see the trust in the fact that they're so relaxed as his photographic subjects. And I think that's really a testament and a tribute to his ability to connect with people, that genius for friendship that people talked about.
The people of the Abyss met with limited success, but it would not be long before Jack enjoyed renewed popularity. The hero of his next book was a dog, Buck. Stolen from his masters to be used in harness in the far north, he had to learn how to survive in this new environment.
Deep in the forest, a call was sounding, and as often as he heard this call, mysteriously thrilling and luring, he felt compelled to turn his back upon the fire and the beaten earth around it, and to plunge into the forest, and on, he knew not where or why, nor did he wonder where or why, the call sounding imperiously deep in the forest.
At one point, he hears the wolves howling in the distance in the forest, and it reaches something deep within this dog that he didn't know was there, and he has to answer that. It's the call of the wild. He answers that and ultimately goes off with a wild wolf pack. He becomes the leader.
One thing that most of the readers may not fully comprehend is how much is there beneath the surface. The Call of the Wild is as rich mythically and archetypally as any work I know. Jack is doing this all these years. You know, he said, I thought I was just writing a good dog story. But one reason the Call of the Wild is internationally famous is that there's so much more than a dog story in it.
When you read The Call of the Wild, you identify with Buck. It's what a dog would experience, it's what a dog would do, it's how a dog would react. At the same time, it's kind of an allegory for how to succeed in a capitalistic society. You have to have self-control. You have to have resilience. You have to adapt. It is a kind of handbook for how to succeed in a brutal world.
Buck was Jack's alter ego. Throughout his Odyssey, Jack describes the nightmares that haunted him, how he too had to fight to survive and to invent a life for himself. And the image of a wolf, from now on printed at the beginning of each of his books, became Jack London's signature as a writer.
He barely made it out of the North, as you know. That whole survival stuff he went through was real. So he had that real sense of what it meant to come close to death, probably on more than one occasion, and that he was very keenly aware of that struggle to survive. And it became a symbol for him of life.
When you think that he wrote The Call of the Wild in 7 weeks and always called it his dog story that got away from him, he meant it to be a short story, and it simply grew and grew. That's an astonishing achievement. And I think that he simply had that story in him, and he simply recorded it. It needed to be written. And I often think that every author may have a story that needs to be written. There are the other books and stories they write, but there's one that absolutely is within them and needs to come out, and it simply pours out of them.
The Call of the Wild was the bestseller of 1903. Thanks to his fame, Jack now worked on the biggest newspapers, such as those owned by press baron William Hearst. At the beginning of 1904, Hearst offered him the chance to travel to Asia to cover the conflict between Russia and Japan for the control of Korea and Manchuria. Confined to Tokyo by the Japanese authorities, Jack decided to travel to Korea clandestinely. Despite the rigors of winter, he sailed down the coast on a sampan as far as Chemulpo, where the Japanese troops were gathering. He followed them as they moved north in a constant game of hide and seek to escape detection. But he never managed to reach the combat zones.
He wasn't able to write the stories that he thought he was going to be able to write, of Russians bayoneting Japanese and him being right up there and smelling the blood and seeing the smoke from the cannons and the machine guns and all that. He wasn't able to do that. He was only able to view artillery duels and troop movements from a distance. London approached his journalism as a fiction writer. And so when he covers the Korean warfare, he needs a character, a main character. And amazingly enough, it's Jack London, right? So we don't really get an idea of what it was like to be in Korea. We get an idea of what it was like to be Jack London in Korea.
During the first great land battle along the banks of the Yalu River, the journalists once again were forced to keep their distance in a converted observatory. Jack was disgusted. "I've wasted 5 months of my life in this war," he declared. When Jack discovered the valet of a Japanese officer stealing from him, he struck him violently. He was arrested, and President Roosevelt in person had to intervene to get him released.
They're going to court-martial him, make an example of him. Roosevelt was a Jack London fan, and he cables the Japanese premier and says, "You mess with Jack London, our guy, and you're going to be messing with the United States and the military over there." So they said, "Okay, we'll send him back home."
The conflict lasted for more than a year and resulted in a crushing Japanese victory. The peace treaty was signed on the 5th of September 1905 in Portsmouth, USA, where Russian and Japanese representatives met under American mediation.
This Russo-Japanese War was the first armed conflict of the 20th century. And Theodore Roosevelt, who was a man who really believed in war in many ways as good for a nation, it was he, ironically, who received the Nobel Prize for Peace because of his help in ending that conflict.
The United States had for some time already decided to apply all her weight in international geopolitics. 7 years earlier, in 1898, the Spanish-American War had allowed the USA to contest Spain's colonies. Spain was forced to give up the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and the island of Guam in the Mariana Islands archipelago. It also had to recognize the independence of Cuba, which now passed into American control.
The United States decided at the end of the war to hang on to those territories. This was America's great leap outward. We are now establishing control, bases, and occupying territory vastly beyond our territorial borders.
As a lieutenant, Theodore Roosevelt distinguished himself during the taking of Cuba and was now a national hero. When he became president in 1902, America adopted the Big Stick policy. The country now set itself up as a moral force, authorized to intervene militarily anywhere in order to defend its interests.
This opened the path for Jack London's own adventures. The American foreign policy, opening the world to American interests, was a phenomenon that allowed for London, with his great imagination and his great ambition, to go into lands that if in an earlier time he simply would not have been able to go.
On the boat which brought him back from Japan to the United States, Jack learned that Bessie had filed for divorce. Despite the arrival of a new baby, their relationship had deteriorated, and Jack had already left the family home more than a year before. Bessie had had his bank accounts frozen and now demanded custody of their 2 daughters, Joan and Becky.
It was a very sad tragedy because they were not suited at all. Bess appears not to have had the kind of playful spirit that Jack had, and he needed someone who could be playful with him. The crowd, people who were Jack London's friends, she thought that they were a bad influence on Jack. They were taking him away from his seriousness of purpose with his writing.
He's still a young man. He's not really ready for fatherhood, I don't think. He was very happy to be a father, but it was always a relationship he had difficulty with. And in that regard, the marriage was going to fail because she was expecting him to behave in some more consistent ways. And here's a man who's always on the go, always going places. A challenging man, you know.
When the divorce became final on the 11th of November 1904, Jack was 28 years old. For several months, he'd been discreet about the relationship he was having with Charmian Kittredge, a woman 5 years his senior and a free and independent spirit. Her feminist ideals were the complete opposite of Bessie's Victorian stuffiness. The couple moved in together in the Valley of the Moon in the north of San Francisco, in a summer residence belonging to Charmian's aunt. Seduced by the beauty of the surroundings, Jack bought up an estate of 50 hectares with the intention to build a ranch there.
London wanted land that he could call his own. He wrote a wonderful letter to George Brett, his editor at Macmillan and Company, in which he says, "I've ridden all over this land in this area, and I've found the land that's for me." And he talked about the moon as it slips behind the hills and casts a magical spell. He found it just enchanting. He had great plans to make that into a great ranch that would fill their lives and be a place, a destination for their friends and family.
On the 18th of November 1905, a year to the day after his divorce was decreed, Jack married Charmian in Chicago. The couple would be inseparable, barely for even a few hours. With Charmian, Jack had found more than a wife. She became his first reader. She was a qualified typist and typed up his manuscripts as he wrote them. Cultivated, sporting, a skilled horsewoman, she also became his companion in adventure, someone with whom he could share everything, even the most daring challenges.
Jack needed a sort of a mate, and they called each other mate. She was mate woman, and he was either mate or mate man. I mean, this is the kind of mate that he needed, because he was always having these sudden inspirations, and then he would work toward that. And she entered into every adventure that he could conceive of.
The reason why they got along so well is beyond just the idea that, you know, they were physically very attracted to each other, intellectually they were very attracted to each other, but she could keep up with him. For their honeymoon, they didn't just go to Jamaica. They took the most treacherous trail around Jamaica together as an adventure. They sought the road less traveled as a way to explore and find things that had never been seen before. And they both shared that love.
In the Valley of the Moon at the end of 1904, Jack began writing a new novel, White Fang. As in The Call of the Wild, the hero of this novel was also a dog. For the author, however, it represented a radical departure. Jack wrote to his publisher, "I'm going to reverse the process. Instead of the devolution or decivilization of a dog, I'm going to give the evolution, the civilization of a dog, development of domesticity, faithfulness, love, morality, and all the amenities and virtues."